Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Thanks for joining. All right, we have a lot of good content in this webinar, so I'm just going to go ahead and get us started while we wait for folks to hop on. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining the 12th annual SEEK Forum's 6th webinar, incorporating environmental justice priorities into regulatory and enforcement policy, featuring the California Public Utilities Commission, Leadership Counsel for Justice and Accountability, and California Air Resources Board. Next slide, please. Perfect. This year's forum is funded and sponsored by 3C-REN, Bay-REN, and SoCal-REN, with additional support from Terra Verde Energy, the Energy Coalition, and TRC. Thanks so much for our sponsors for making this forum possible. Next slide, please. And I also want to give a huge shout out to our promo partners for helping us extend our reach so that you all can hear from one another. Okay, next slide. Perfect. And we just want to go over some quick housekeeping. Please be sure to ask any questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A box. You'll have an option to upvote questions that you would like to see answered. So we really encourage you to use that feature. It really helps us figure out which questions to prioritize. And additionally, we encourage you to use the chat box to interact with other participants, introduce yourself, or reach out to SEEK staff, which would be myself, Serena Soar, or John Vandervoort, for any tech issues you may be encountering. And on to the next slide. I'm happy to introduce our moderator for today, Monica Camara, who is an analyst at the California Public Utilities Commission. Thanks for joining us, Monica.
All right. Can folks hear me okay? Yeah, okay. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am so excited to be able to host this conversation in partnership with all of you because we have some amazing speakers and leaders to hear from today. So just wanted to give a little bit of introduction before I introduce our speakers about why this session, why this topic, and kind of what we intend to explore in the hour or so that we have together. So just first off, but a little intro. So my name is Monica, again, Public Utilities Commission. My role at the Public Utilities Commission is to implement our Environmental and Social Justice Action Plan, or ESJ Action Plan. And you'll hear a little bit more about that from one of our commissioners who's here today. But in that work and in work that I've done previously, I think work related to environmental justice and work with disadvantaged communities, I have had some experience doing a lot of investment-oriented work in disadvantaged communities. So prior to my role at the PUC, I worked for the Strategic Growth Council. Some folks may be familiar with that agency. And we had a lot of cap and trade funds and money to be able to invest in disadvantaged communities and environmental justice communities on really exciting climate-oriented projects. And my role was to travel around and build relationships in these communities and really think about these investment opportunities and the future and whatnot. And I think a lot of state agencies and agencies have been doing more and more in this investment space in terms of prioritizing disadvantaged communities and environmental justice communities, making sure resources are prioritized there. Certainly have a long way to go, but I think there's been a lot that's happened in that area. And then since my time now at the PUC, I think in this evolution of really trying to center environmental justice communities in the work of our environmentally oriented agencies, I think that the work of doing regulatory policy and then ultimately enforcement of that policy is a whole other ballgame. It sometimes involves perhaps more conflict than an investment-oriented conversation, or it involves really thinking about the past and trying to atone for that in a way that I think is really unique and really challenging. So I know that's something that I've been thinking a lot about as I've been at the PUC for about 2 years and in implementing our Environmental and Social Justice Action Plan. And I wanted to just have some conversation in partnership with all of you and in partnership with these amazing leaders. So we're so excited to have them be able to pontificate on this question of regulatory policy, investment, and enforcement in environmental justice communities, where we are and where we have to go. So just wanted to start off with that introduction. Real quick, before we introduce our speakers, we wanted to get a sense of who's in the room. Looks like we have about 58 folks on the line. And if LGC, if Serena, if folks could throw up the poll, just wanted to get a sense of where folks are coming from, if they're coming from a community-based organization, local government, university. If folks could just let us know where you're from, that will help us make sure we tailor our conversation. So I'm gonna participate too, state government. Great. So we'll just give folks a few seconds here to fill that out, and then that'll help us know who we're working with. Serena, you have the ability to throw up the results, I guess, right?
Yes, looks like we're at about 80% participation, so
Okay.
we'll wait a few more seconds.
Okay, great. And additionally, as actually Jennifer, hi Jennifer, thanks for going ahead and beating me to the punch in the chat. If folks would like to introduce themselves in the chat with your name, your pronouns, if you're representing an organization, we'd love to hear who's here. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat as well. All right. So yeah, I guess we'll take a look at those results. We can put those up. All right. Oh, cool. A little bit more of a mix. So we've got some community organizations, some consultants, a utility maybe or two, local government, state government. Great. Great. That's good. That's a good little breakdown. So that means we can speak to a wide audience in terms of how we think about these things. Great. Okay. And so last thing too is, Serena mentioned it at the beginning. So the way our format's going to go today, it's a little bit more traditional. We're going to have 10-minute presentations from each of our speakers, or comments, reflections. So about 30 minutes of that. And then we're going to really try to spend most of our time in discussion and Q&A mode. So if folks in the session, if you want to use both the Q&A feature and the chat feature, we'll keep an eye on that, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible in our discussion. So please feel free to make use of that. And that's how we'll spend our time. So with that, I want to introduce our speakers. So we are lucky to have Commissioner Marta Guzman Aceves from the Public Utilities Commission. She's going to talk to us a little bit about what's happening at the PUC. After that, we'll hear from Ashley Werner. She's the directing attorney at Leadership Counsel for Justice and Accountability. So on the ground, community-based organization, seeing how this stuff plays out in real life. And then we'll also hear from Deputy Executive Officer for Environmental Justice, Chanel Fletcher from the California Air Resources Board, to hear another perspective of how a state agency is approaching these opportunities. So with that, I'll turn it over to Commissioner Guzman Aceves. Please take it away, and I'll throw up your slides.
Thank you, Monica. It's good to see some familiar names in the chat. Please keep those coming. It's good to see who's all here. Thank you for inviting me here today. In many ways, I feel like I'm talking to a group of people who know this better than I do. So I'm going to walk through this quickly so we can get to the dialogue. Because at the end of the day, I think when we talk about environmental and social justice issues, we're not forgetting the individuals and the individual communities as we take on these statewide policies or these utility-wide programs, whatever it may be, is trying to stay committed to the local and to the equity issues that come about. So I'm going to talk very specifically about an effort actually that Monica led with many other folks and Commissioner Rexhoffen really led as well. And that's really getting us a plan of action that's adaptive and live at the PUC to set some goals around what our environmental and social justice activities and goals are. And it's really interesting because even in the development of the plan and how widely we wanted to have the breadth of the plan encompass, there was even some discussion there because when you're talking about certain issues and you broaden the issue base, you dilute the issue. So in many ways, this plan is very comprehensive, but the challenge with it is maintaining the focus on the individual priorities. So I'm going to walk through that and, of course, get into questions after. Okay, so go ahead and move along here. So these are just some of what we this is not all of the actions, but I think from my personal perspective, the thing that really has us be a responsive government that's serving, the people of California is we obviously have a meaningful venue for them to participate in our process. This is something that we are constantly struggling with at the PUC because of our quasi-judicial process. But it's something that I'll talk about how we've made some strides in, but are continuing to challenge ourselves to do better. Secondly is actually one of the things that I think has been really important for my time here as a commissioner to see evolve. I remember one of my first meetings talking about how we were looking at the life cycle impacts of natural gas, and something the ARB, I know we have Chanel here later today, has been looking at for some time, but it was not something that was really thought about. And I give that example because many times we look at an issue and what evidence has been proposed to us with that issue. But as statewide policymakers, and as any policymaker, local or regional, we need to understand the cumulative impacts of that. And sometimes that requires us independently bringing that information into our policymaking. And what we call in our world, we say we need to bring that into the record. So this requires a lot of intentionality in our decision making and our policy making to actually go out and get that and make sure we're not just looking at something, I won't even say it superficially, but something that is not, comprehensive. And then finally, we have some really great books, some really good laws on the books, and also good regulations and good programs that we've authorized. But if we're not implementing them, and if we're not enforcing them, and enforcing them particularly in communities and in customers that are prone to predatory activity around them, then we're not gonna get to where we need to get to in terms of our environmental goals and certainly our environmental justice and social justice goals. So talk a little bit about that, but I think these are kind of been my my drivers in what I try to do in my everyday. And I'm sure that many of you share these. Okay, next slide. And I'll try to go a little faster. So just a little history here. We started working on the plan and finally adopted the first one in February 2019. And I'll just note that the plan was not adopted unanimously. Okay, next slide. These are the 9 goals in the Environmental and Social Justice Action Plan. And I won't read them all, but you'll see that there's things like workforce training that are much more focused on the social aspect of our work, and climate resiliency that's obviously very focused on the environmental aspect of our work. So we set out these goals, and as I said, I'll go through how we're going to update them because potentially these will evolve. But I think these are so comprehensive that we're going to have at least a core continue for some time. Okay, next slide. This is a picture of the folks that were involved. And the thing that was really very strategic is that we ask each of our divisions, and we have multiple divisions at the PUC. We have rail safety, which is actually our oldest division that many people don't know about. Energy division, of course, our communications, which deals with the internet and telecommunications, safety and enforcement division, water division. So all of the divisions that we have provided a representation, a liaison to really work within their divisions and within this greater team of the ESJ action plan. Next slide. Okay, so one of the examples of a goal that has succeeded is, and not that it's ending, but we're making progress on it, is really incorporating this intentionality into our proceedings. Is this topic, whether it's a railroad crossing or an acquisition of a water system or electrification of vehicles, whatever the subject may be, how does this issue address and further our action plan and our goals. And that just asking that question has provided so much opportunity to improve our policies. Okay, next slide. Okay, so another example is the increasing the public participation in our process. And this may seem so basic to so many of you, but I'm almost kind of ashamed to talk about it in this way because many of you are so much further along. But previously we would not actually have all the public comments that we received on a topic wouldn't be in the actual docket of the proceeding in a way that was accessible to the public and in a way that was accessible to the formal parties. And this does, does a few things that maybe I won't spend a lot of time on it, but just to say that having that integration now and the ability to even take it one step further so parties could even use it potentially even as evidence if they want to, we've enabled that now. And more importantly, we've enabled the transparency of more people in the general public to see what the rest of the public has said. We've done a few different things on CBO outreach, and I'm sure maybe Monica, you've been more involved with that, so we can take questions on that later if there's interest. We've updated all of the templates that we use to really inform customers on, we have really poor ways of communicating things like bill increases in particular, and really explaining in totality how that's happening. So we've taken a fresh look at those templates to try to make it at minimum more understanding, and also to know how to access and engage in that process. And we're happy to say that the governor did appoint a tribal advisor to the PUC, Ken Holbrook. That position is not codified yet, but hopefully it's something that becomes institutionalized and could get codified. Next slide. Okay, okay. So this is another example of one of our goals, the training that's taken place. And really, I mentioned just right now the importance of institutionalizing the way of making policy in this way. And most recently, I'll just talk about the last bullet. We were fortunate enough to incorporate the ESJ plan into the new employee training orientation. And so, here's the new workforce into our agency that's receiving this as, a core set of values and goals and objectives that their work needs to incorporate. So I think when we talk about, also institutionalizing this into our work moving forward, that was a great example of how we are starting to do that. Okay, next slide. This is just an example of a proceeding that's near and dear to my heart. It was a proceeding that was identifying the communities in the San Joaquin Valley that do not have access to natural gas, and so are primarily propane dependent and wood as well. And just as an example of the acknowledgement of the inability for many of these communities and community members to participate in our process, that at the time was actually even more isolated in kind of San Francisco based. And this took it out on the road back in the days where we could be on the road and talking to people in person. And so we made a very intentional effort at the outset to seek that community engagement. And there's so many lessons learned from that proceeding, but it is an example where we really took on the active role of being physically in the communities to engage in our rulemaking. Okay, next slide. And this just gives a little more detail on the work that we did, but we can move on to the next slide. And just to say that now with the ESJ action plan, there's been so much, it's not that it wasn't happening before, but there's been more depth into our rulemakings on this. As an example, the disconnections proceeding, which eliminated some of the most regressive fees that we've had on our lowest income customers, as well as the real racial divide that we saw in the implementation of those fees. So that's one really great example. in our next agenda, actually, we'll be voting on a decision to cap the rates on incarcerated people's calls from jails and prisons. That's a very exciting proposal that we'll be voting on hopefully in the next couple of weeks. Our public safety power shutoff proceeding, as many of you know, has been a very difficult set of actions. We're obviously where we're at. Everyone knows where we're at today with our situation of our fires. And one of the things that was a good progress in this proceeding, and again, many of you in local government has been doing this for so long, is we made the utilities get very local in their outreach, including their language access. And in some cases, in particular, remembering in the Edison case, the indigenous Mexican languages that are spoken in many of the agricultural areas of our state. And also in the broadband infrastructure proceeding, where we have really taken on the issue of digital redlining and providing a forum to how to deal with that equity issue. Okay, I think I'm out of time, so I'll just skip through these next slides and see if there's anything further worth highlighting. No, okay. Just to note that we keep the plan as an adaptive and live document. So thank you very much. And I'll switch it back over to you, Monica.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Thank you so much, Commissioner. I think we are going to just keep it moving and turn to Ashley. Now, hold on just one second. I got to make sure I get my slides together. And then we'll do more Q&A once we get through the presentations. Oh, let me load up these slides. All right, is that looking okay, Ashley?
Yes, but that is the third slide.
Oh, well, let's fix that. Okay, there we go.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for having me on this panel today. This is a really important topic. I'm going to share some information about the work we do, why we think this topic is so important, and give you an example of how we think state agencies have done some effective work in applying an EJ lens to their regulatory and enforcement work, and then also highlight some opportunities and challenges that we see. So Leadership Counsel works with residents and grassroots leaders from disadvantaged communities from Merced to Kern County in the San Joaquin Valley, as well as in the East Coachella Valley, to eradicate wide-ranging disparities impacting those communities. And we work to secure changes in local, regional, and state policy and practice, and use legal advocacy and litigation to enforce environmental and civil rights laws on behalf of those communities. So from our vantage point, the intentional and explicit use of an environmental justice lens in state regulatory and enforcement work, and essentially in any government work, is essential to preventing the perpetuation and exacerbation of environmental disparities. And I think a lot of this information is familiar to you. I see a lot of people work in some way on equity and environmental justice issues, but I think it's just worth naming that environmental justice is baked into our cities and counties in a myriad of ways that touch really every aspect of life for people who live in disadvantaged communities and people of color. And so from the work we do, this includes whether and to what extent communities have access to civic engagement opportunities, safe and affordable drinking water, adequate wastewater systems, parks and green space, decent quality affordable housing, and clean air, as well as the quantity and type of investments in their neighborhoods and the location of polluting and hazardous land uses. And so it's of course disadvantaged communities and people of color that experience these disparities in all of these different arenas. And those disparities are getting worse with climate change. There's a lot of ways that we could name and talk about how communities on a daily basis are being more and more impacted by environmental injustice because of climate change. And so all of this together has very dire consequences for residents' access to opportunity, their quality of life, their health outcomes, and their longevity. And I think in a lot of ways as a society, we've normalized it. It's something we live with. We hear the statistics, we hear the news, but it's really like a grave reality that impacts people's lives in a very serious way on a daily basis.
And so, this environmental injustice is rooted in very explicit racially discriminatory policies that go back to the formation of our cities and counties. And the environmental burdens we see today, the communities that bear those burdens largely overlap with the same communities that were targeted very explicitly by racially discriminatory policies, such as redlining that we've all heard about. I have a little graphic in here from the Cal EPA's recent racial equity analysis for its draft Cal EnviroScreen 4.0 tool that found that the top 10% most environmentally burdened neighborhoods in California were comprised of 90% people of color. And then when you look at what are the communities that are faring the best and have the least environmental burden, they're disproportionately communities comprised of white residents. So we have very persistent racially based inequities and environmental injustice that stem back from the inceptions of our cities and counties. And so I wanted to provide that backdrop to say that there is no neutral state policy or enforcement practice. There really is no neutral government practice. Every practice is being layered on top of incredible inequity. So if there's not an environmental justice lens applied, at the best, an inequity is being perpetuated. And in the worst case, which is often the case, the disparity is deepened. So really everybody, I think all of us collectively, and especially those of us who are within government or able to influence government very directly, have a responsibility to be attuned to those inequities and injustices and trying to understand how we can have a practice that is aware of them and addressing them. Next slide. So I will provide a little bit of information about a topic I could talk about for way too long on South Central Fresno, where the Attorney General's office and also the California Air Resources Board have done some really good work in using an environmental justice lens to help really support the community in its advocacy, especially for protection from new sources of pollution from warehouse distribution centers and other industrial facilities. So South Central Fresno, to give you a little information about it, it includes both incorporated and unincorporated neighborhoods. They rank among the most pollution burdened in California. It includes the top most pollution burdened neighborhood under Cal EnviroScreen. They are predominantly disproportionately comprised of people of color, people who don't speak English, and immigrants, and lower income households. The neighborhoods score so poorly or highly on Cal EnviroScreen for a lot of reasons, which include being encircled by freeways, being subject to high volumes of truck traffic through neighborhoods, having the presence of a lot of different types of polluting industrial facilities, contaminated groundwater, and very deep disinvestment. So, you can see a little bit of it on one of the photos here, lack of sidewalks, even though there's thousands of trucks going along the roads, lack of street lights, lack of green space. What's behind this truck in this picture on the bottom here is a landfill. So that's across the street from a resident's home that we work with. And so, there's been a lot of zoning to bring in industrial uses that political leaders rely on to build an economic base, but not investment in zoning and investment to bring in things that the community really wants to see, like parks and grocery stores. So in recent years, there's been a very large influx of warehouse development that's been spurred in part by the city zoning 5,000 acres of land in the area and pre-zoning it, including entire neighborhoods to be built over with industrial development. And so as those have come in, we have worked really closely with residents to support them in efforts to seek protections from those facilities, make sure they're complying with environmental and civil rights laws, and then to seek more systemic solutions so that they're not kind of playing whack-a-mole and fighting one by one perpetually as these facilities are sited next to their houses and their schools. So if you see at the top of the slide here, there's a photo of the playground at Orange Center Elementary School, and behind it there's some buildings, and those are warehouses, and you can't really see it, but their truck docks all face the playground, so there are hundreds of trucks every day coming in and having their diesel emissions flowing directly towards the schoolyard. So, so throughout all of this, over the past several years, the State Attorney General's Office, through its Bureau of Environmental Justice and also CARB, have played important roles in supporting the community's efforts. They've done it in a number of different ways. They have submitted written comments at critical moments when projects have come forward. They've engaged in dialogue with local elected officials alongside residents, and really done it in a way that's backing up residents and supporting them. And in the case of the Attorney General's Office, they intervened in litigation on the side of residents. There was a 2 million square foot warehouse that was being proposed across the street from this resident's home and across the street from a community, and had done hardly any environmental review. And it was going to have a pretty severe impact, and there was no public process on it until advocates kind of found out about it serendipitously. And so the Attorney General ended up intervening in that case. So a couple things I wanted to highlight as positive practices that were employed. And I guess I won't get too deep into the details with them, but just kind of highlighted a high level. Some of the things I thought were helpful and could be used in other agency contexts is one, staff from both agencies have visited the community, talked with residents directly, and talked with CBOs. So they have a lived, to some degree, a lived experience and understanding of what the impacts are. And I think that's really helpful in their ability to do the work and their motivation to sustain that work. They've developed and maintained close connections with residents and advocates. So there's an open line of communication that allows them to stay on top of the issues and intervene at critical moments. There are staff that are passionate about EJ, that really care about it. I think that's really critical. Is people can't develop that, but it's also really important to have staff that have worked on environmental justice, who get it, and who really bring that lens to their work and a passion. They've been willing to act quickly at certain times when there's been short decision-making timelines. There have been moments where they have been guided by principle. There is a lot of political pressure that gets put on agencies when they are attempting to kind of stand up to the status quo, especially when there's vested interests at play. And it's absolutely critical that leaders base decisions based on what's right, what's environmentally just, and not politically expedient. And then agencies and staff have stayed the course for years. So intervening once, while that's good, it's not enough. Like environmental injustice was created over decades. It continues on a daily basis. And so it's really necessary to have sustained oversight and engagement. And just in brief, this is really, the positive outcomes has been that it's helped stop projects that would have had really serious environmental and public health consequences when those projects were not reviewed. It's helped us get political leverage to create a more open process to explore more systemic solutions to these issues, particularly through a specific planning process looking at rezoning potentially. Next slide. And I know I'm probably close to time, so maybe I'll just kind of like bullet point these challenges and opportunities. So as far as like challenges, and I think there's like a lot that could be talked about with these. I think a big challenge is our local control mantra. It's kind of like a core belief that's held in California politics, and that is often not balanced with civil rights and basic protections for human health and well-being. So that's something we need to work on. I think agencies have a lot more power than they often acknowledge, and a lot more authority. And it can be scary to exercise that power and come with political risks and career risks. And I think there is a lot of need for agencies to continue to build out their willingness to use their authority. We also need to invest in staffing to fully staff enforcement, fully staff developing out agency expertise in the EJ area. Couple opportunities are, we've evolved in the last few years our fair housing and civil rights mandates in California. There's a lot of need and opportunity to implement new authorities that have been developed and articulated. And then there's a lot of like really significant planning requirements that are now in the process of being implemented, where it's an opportunity for agencies to set the standard for how they're going to implement new requirements. Housing elements have new fair housing requirements. Groundwater sustainability plans are being reviewed that will kind of make or break whether communities are going to have access to water in coming years. So there's a number of really critical opportunities for agencies to step up. So I'll stop there and really interested for the conversation that we'll have after Chanel.
Thanks so much, Ashley. It's so helpful to hear these local examples, and you really hit the nail on some of these real enforcement opportunities. So thank you so much. Yeah, now we're going to turn it over to Chanel, Deputy Executive Officer for Environmental Justice. Chanel, yeah, definitely looking to hear some of your reflections on what you've heard so far, and then what this looks like at the Air Resources Board. So take it away.
Happy to do so. And so I am slide free, so you get all of me in my very summer appearance right now. I'm just coming off of like 2 days of vacation and getting readjusted to work life, right? Yes. Fish take vacations. So I'm really glad that I got to go after the commissioner and after Ashley, because I think a lot of what they spoke to, I'm going to touch on as well. I think, as Monica said, my name is Chanel Fletcher. I'm the Deputy Executive Officer of Environmental Justice at CARB. And really, I think the purpose of my role and my unit and our division and what we're trying to do is really make sure that throughout CARB, so when you're looking at our policies, our regulations, environmental justice is not only being mentioned or talked about, it's being addressed and operationalized in a way that it is tangible and clear for people to see. So I think today we're talking about enforcement, and I wanted to give a little bit of background just for CARB on kind of like our role around enforcement. And so in California, CARB is responsible for mobile sources, that's cars, trucks, mobile equipment, fuels, and actually, I think kind of as Ashley had mentioned, local air districts have the primary authority over stationary sources, although CARB, we do retain that oversight authority over local districts. So I just wanted to emphasize, Ashley already had brought it up when she was talking about the role of local governments and those local land use policies. And it is very, I think, something that is very clear, I think, even in our role of looking at that mobile sources and really those local air districts having the primary authority over stationary sources. So our enforcement program, so we do send out staff to listen, to participate in local community meetings. Through that, one of the good things about that, I think, has been that our enforcement staff has come to realize, I think, all of the points that Ashley really did bring up, particularly around understanding the role that environmental racism has played when we're talking about the impacts that communities are facing, as well as understanding that many communities, particularly BIPOC communities, do not only feel, but are and have been just neglected and ignored by state and local authorities. So for our enforcement division for CARB, one of the things that we are now, I think, making a big shift on as we're talking about environmental justice, it's really understanding that our role as government has been that we have been the ones that have created a lot of, I think, what Ashley had mentioned and what we've heard. And so it is our role and our responsibility to address the inequities and environmental injustices that we have, I think, created and perpetuated. I'm not saying that's easy, but I am saying that that's how we see our role, and that's what we want to strive and achieve to. So let me say that before everybody goes out and says, CARB's gonna go out and change the world. It's like, yes, that is our aspiration and our vision, but a lot of these things are very challenging to do. So one of the things that I did want to talk about is how we're incorporating environmental justice. This is, as I pointed out before, really a work in progress for us, again, as we're thinking about environmental justice and how do we start to operationalize that. I think one of the biggest things for us has been how are we improving our outreach at the local level as we develop new regulations. One of the biggest, most important things that I would emphasize is that we have to not only be thinking about the industries that we're regulating, but the communities that have been impacted and that are going to be impacted by any new regulations that come out. So it's been really critical and essential for us to start thinking about how we're kind of improving and engaging with communities, how we do that in a way where it's not extractive and it's not transactional. And this really is a shift for us because I think we tend to kind of focus our outreach on those that we're regulating. And so for us, there's been a bigger shift of how are we actually centering, I think, communities and giving them that same kind of attention and focus really to think about what are the impacts going to be. One of the things that we're also really thinking about as we're looking at, environmental justice and incorporating it into our enforcement program we're thinking about how do we, I think when we're talking about enforcement and when we kind of go out, when we're listening, when we're looking at, different sources, how are we prioritizing and focusing our efforts in the communities that need it the most? And what is our metric to do that? How are we looking at disadvantaged communities and thinking about, in terms of the prioritization, where does that fall and how does that happen for us? How do we, again, kind of think about those community meetings as a space to understand the pollution concerns and then prioritize our inspections and our programmatic enforcement efforts to actually address what we're hearing, right? So it can't just be that we're out there, we're doing the outreach, we're getting all that input. There actually does need to be action. And so for us, how are we kind of being clear about how we're prioritizing our inspections and the work that we're doing in enforcement to actually address and provide benefits? And if we can't, how are we being transparent about those conversations as well? One of, I think, the big issues that we do hear very often from communities are actually raised around local industrial or stationary sources. So it's very timely to be here, the Local Government Commission. And one of the things that I think, we understand, as I mentioned from the very beginning, around the responsibility of local area districts, we're talking about stationary sources, but we also understand that if we're committing to environmental justice and really thinking about how that shows up in our enforcement program, there really does need to be a commitment on our end, right? So that when we're hearing these complaints, to really engage and work with these local air districts on these issues to start to improve not only communication, but action on community concerns. And so that's one of the things that we want to do, is that we want to be more than just a conduit for complaints. We don't want to just people have to come in and say, we have a complaint, we have a complaint, we have a complaint. But we actually do want to provide active support between the air districts and local governments to really kind of address the issues that we're hearing about. I think these are all very big and important things. And so I'm very excited to say them. At the same time, when I think about what's in front of us, one of the things I wanted to just, again, kind of keep acknowledging and kind of keep bringing up to the forefront is that we're putting a lot of energy into reforming our enforcement program to be more focused on addressing environmental injustice and environmental racism. But we have a lot of work to do on that front. So it's not something that's going to happen overnight. We really do need to be better about, again, I'm going to keep saying this, engaging with communities and figuring out how we do that in a way where it's not just, we have a public workshop, everybody come, which I think is not effective, but also not overly relying on, for example, our AB 617 communities. But we have to kind of think about what we're doing with that and making sure that we're really getting that community engagement. And so one of the things that I wanted to mention, right, is like, for example, there's like the IVA network, right? For folks that don't know, that's the Identifying Violations Affecting Neighborhoods Network. We know that we have like 8 California disadvantaged communities participating in that. So that's like Bayview, Hunters Point, Coachella, Fresno, Imperial Valley, Kern, Kings County, Tulare, and Wilmington. And so one of the things that we have been doing, right, we've been taking, so the staff that are under me within the Office of Environmental Justice of CARB have been working closely with the enforcement division, but also with those community-based organizations in those communities to really start thinking about how can we kind of attend these meetings, how can we start to listen to these concerns, listen to what we're hearing, and then start to kind of actually partner with communities to start to figuring out like what are the solutions and what does it look like to address that. These are very kind of like nascent conversations in some ways, but I think it's our attempt to start to think about how do we come at this from much more of a community-based approach versus a very top-down approach, which I think we are historically known for. One of the things that we do believe, right, is that if we can get better at listening to community concerns and targeting our action to address those concerns, I think we would see a huge change a lot. And I think in terms of the enforcement piece, I think there, again, like some other the barriers where we're kind of like the piece around, I think, again, like local air districts and local control is something that I think we also continue to think about our partnership with local air districts and local governments, and how can we effectively leverage that partnership so that we're working collaboratively and that we're working together to really kind of hear community concerns and create together kind of actions to address them. I think the whole point should be that government should be and should feel holistic. And that's been one of, I think, the biggest struggles is that we very often operate in silos. So it's like CARB is over here, this air district's over there. And I think what we want to do is start to break down some of the silos and become, I think, more holistic and more effective. One of the other things that I did want to mention too is that we do have other programs that have been focused on things like air filtration and providing funds through our settlements to really kind of start targeting community specific concerns and to work with communities on like actually providing funding to address some of the concerns they're bringing up through enforcement. So one of our bigger things is like, how do we take some of those programs, give them not just more attention, but actually daylight them more so that communities are aware of these programs, aware of these funds, and how they can be used to address some of the concerns that are coming up as well. So I say all of that to say that I'm excited to be here, excited to have this conversation, and really, I think excited to kind of hear and learn from folks as well to think about refining as we further refine our approach. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, Chanel. That's great. Thanks to you three. So real quick, so I do see some Q&As in here. They're mostly specific to us at the PUC. So I definitely want to get to them maybe a little, just when I get to on a few questions that maybe hit on all of our speakers first, and then I'm going to tackle the ones in the Q&A. But first, before I dive into a question, wanted to give Ashley and Commissioner Guzman-Aceves a chance to either add to their presentation or any additional reflections before I lob a question your way.
I didn't have anything additional right now, but I did appreciate hearing Chanel. Thanks so much. And you did not need the slides.
Yeah.
I didn't need the slides. Anything, Commissioner Guzman-Aceves, or I'm happy to just pitch the question.
Yeah, let's hear the questions.
All right. Well, I mean, the first one wanted to start with a little bit, and I see more coming in the Q&A, so I'll keep an eye on those. Is, you know, this question of local governments. Chanel, you were starting to get on this, and what can, you know, we're coming from the state level. Ashley, you're local from the community-based organizations, but you talked about leveraging state agencies for a local issue. What is the leadership role that local governments can and should play on their own and in partnership with those of us that are at state agencies? What can that look like?
I can start with some thoughts. So I think local governments, you know, ideally should be playing a central leadership role. You know, I was talking about local control and our local control mantra. Like, it is true that local governments are best positioned to really understand the on-the-ground issues and to exhibit leadership in addressing environmental injustice. And I just think, you know, too often in the places we see, that is not being prioritized. So I think there's like a lot of different really important ways that they're being called on a daily basis to address environmental injustice, where there's a big need for them to kind of jump to another level. And I think, you know, one is planning mandates. You know, we now have a lot of pretty good planning mandates in California, SB 1000, environmental justice elements, with housing elements now, there's more of an environmental justice component to it with the affirmatively furthering fair housing duty. So local governments can really take that seriously. And I think a lot of it comes back to elected officials, you know, wanting to really meet the letter of the law and go beyond it so that staff feel empowered to do that too. Because I think at the end of the day, staff are, you know, answering to their bosses. And then like a couple big areas too are just, you know, them using their enforcement powers. Like there are zoning ordinances in place and standards designed to protect people. And very often we just see that those don't get enforced in communities we work in. You know, establishing really robust public participation processes, and then also taking leadership at the state level, getting engaged in state level processes to support environmental justice solutions. And I think very rarely do we really see local governments doing that kind of engagement to support environmental justice policy at the state level. So those are a couple examples that come to mind.
Thanks, Ashley.
I could say a couple of areas, you know, certainly this group I think is focused on energy. I'll talk a little bit about that, of course, but the other very exciting area is the legislature and the governor recently approved $6 billion for broadband infrastructure. And we are going to be involved with that. In particular, there's a $2 billion budget for last mile infrastructure, as well as a loan loss reserve for local governments if they are going to take on some of these builds themselves. So that's you know, dealing with the digital divide, literally local government can take this on now with the state and now federal funding soon to be coupled with it, to really take that on directly. And that's like a real direct infrastructure issue. And, you know, there's, including on the telecommunications side, but I think what we're seeing in the energy sector here is a real transformation, even if we're talking about private utilities, energy utilities. The amount of involvement now, particularly with the growth of CCAs that many of you are involved with, and in the procurement of energy, but not just in the procurement of energy, of course, in the RENs that many of you are also involved with, energy efficiency, carrying out those investments, and kind of starting to get more interwoven with all of the provision of energy as well as the procurement of energy. And I think that's going to continue to grow. I tend to believe, although the jury's still out on this, that having that greater role for local government in procuring and playing a bigger role in these different elements of the energy space is hopeful to be more equitable. But that's still a question. Somebody in the chat asked about distributed solar, and we do have a couple of programs that I do want to make sure to highlight: the Disadvantaged Community Green Tariff and the Disadvantaged Community Solar Program. Both are also, the CCAs are also involved in those programs, and they're very directly involved. They're procuring the energy and the customers are getting a discount. And so, you know, we've seen the CCAs and the utilities play they're kind of at par right now, but we'll see how it evolves. And if the local governments through the CCAs, you know, take this on in a different way, maybe a deeper way, potentially a deeper discount to these customers. So those are just a couple of thoughts, but very specific to programs.
No, thank you. Thank you. Chanel, any more elaboration? You spoke to some of this in terms of the collaborative nature, but I don't know if you want to add anything in terms of leadership on local government's part.
No, I mean, I think I said no, and then I was like, let me just keep talking. I will say that I appreciate both comments that were kind of made by the commissioner, by Ashley, and they make a lot of sense to me. I think that local government really, I think, in a prime place to respond to a lot of the concerns that we hear. And I think just because of their proximity. At the same time, I do think that it's really important that we're working together and we're working collaboratively. And so especially when I think about enforcement, because like I said in my note, you're right, like I said in my notes, that we do get a lot of complaints about different facilities, whether that's in Bayview, Hunters Point, you know, whether that's down south. And so part of the question people are always asking is like, we've already got here and we've got nothing. So now we're coming to you as that oversight role. What are you going to do? And I think the ideal way that we would want this to work is that people don't have to come to us in that oversight role, because we are already proactively working together to address the concerns, and we're kind of looped in and we hear what's happening. And in some places and in some air districts that is already happening, right? And so I don't want to say that like it's not happening at all, but in some air districts it's already happening. And in other places we do have more work to do. And I think that's one of the commitments that you're hearing from CARB, is that we really do want to have that community focused approach, but we want to do it, you know, in collaboration with air districts, and also I think with like EPA when we're talking about definitely different sources.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Kind of building on, each of you talked about community involvement and community engagement and how that's just so critical to furthering environmental justice priorities in regulatory and enforcement related work. And I want to tie in a question from Alejandra Tellez. So she says, you know, how do we make sure that communities, EJ communities that have been ignored, don't continue to be left behind? Examples, these communities, residential and small businesses, didn't have the opportunity to take advantage of lighting incentives and moving to LED, or taking advantage of solar programs, but now those incentives and rebates are gone, or now minimal, and they might be left behind again. So how, we talked a little bit about it, but would love to hear y'all elaborate on how we can make sure folks aren't left behind in some of this transition work that we're doing too.
I'm happy to take a shot at that. Even as we look at the local governments that are involved in the RENs and the energy efficiency programs, there's none that I know of in the Central Valley. I think there was one that was hitting some of the Inland Empire, and you guys can correct me on that. But yes, what we've seen in government is those local governments that are astute, that have capacity, that have the wherewithal, come to us or come to the utilities, and they work out a partnership or a program. We are lacking this other side of the TCC model, really, which is to say, we need to go to the communities that have a deficit and then everything in between there. So what I kind of default to, which is not always popular, is set-asides, minimum thresholds, and the pre-identification work of these indicators. Of course, the OEHA tool has been the most resourceful tool for identification of disadvantaged communities. But as the example here on communities without LED lights in their communities, every issue that we deal with, we have at the state or government level, whatever level of government we're in, have the obligation to look at where the needs are, first and foremost, in order to be equitable in our funding. And we haven't always done that. Most of the time, at least in our agency, the more traditional model is either the legislature or somebody at the program side develops a program, tells us to go get it done, and get it done quickly. And usually that means we don't have the requirement or sometimes the time to figure out where the need is. So I would say that if you don't have that time, then you set aside. At minimum for low income, we have the OEHA tool as a backstop, and then you could get specific, like our broadband funding needs to go to the places that are unserved. We have that needs analysis, fortunately.
Thank you. Ashley or Chanel?
I know I should have something to say about this, but I don't feel like I have a great point to add on top other than just, residents, I think, have made really clear what their needs are. For the most part, we know a lot of them. So really, listening to that and centering it and developing practices to make sure we're responding to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think and I paused only because I was thinking thoughtfully about this, because I think one of the things that the point of the question that I really appreciated was, how do we make sure that these communities don't continue to be left behind? And I think we have tools, right? So we have some of the tools to identify the communities that we're talking about. And so for me, part of this is really around the specificity of who are we talking about, like what communities. And, we have like Cal and Virus Screen at CARB, we have like our, CCI, like we have priority communities, we have BIPOC communities. I hear in a lot of ways that we use a lot of different terms when we're talking about communities, and sometimes we just say communities overall. And so part of it for me is like, how do we get very clear and specific about the communities that we do need to be engaged with, that we do need to be listening to? How do we start to, I don't want to say even quantify that, but actually track that and measure that? And I think as I brought up again, I'll say, how do we start to kind of work collaboratively with local governments? And I'm sorry, my email keeps chiming, as you guys can all hear probably, but how do we start to work collaboratively with local governments to do this work more effectively? And I think those are some of the questions that we're grappling with our enforcement division. And like I said, we have our AB 617 communities, and that's one piece. We also have, over 400 communities that are 617 eligible. And so whenever I think about AB 617, I think about the enormity of the task in front of us. I think about the fact that enforcement's a large part of that. And then I think about, well, like, is this the model? Is this what we should be doing? Are there other models when we're talking about, again, getting that specific level of making sure that communities don't get left behind? And are even those communities that we're talking about? So hopefully that wasn't me rambling when I say the two things around specificity matters in terms of who we're talking about, and that collaboration piece I think is essential and important, and being very clear on the roles of like the oversight role and the role of local governments I think will be really huge as well.
Yeah, thank you. Alejandra, I just want to offer one more reflection on your question about making sure we don't leave communities behind. And this is actually a reflection I'm having from having moderated a different in LGC session as part of the California Adaptation Forum. And our equitable adaptation track, we held a session about dismantling white supremacy in our organizations and how that is key to making sure that the solutions and the programs and the policies and the enforcement that we're doing actually reaches the environmental justice communities and communities of color. And that if we're not doing the work in our organizations on that front, in terms of more directly racial equity work, the things that we come up with aren't going to make it to the communities we're trying to make it to. And so I know that's like a much bigger question that we're calling into, but I think it's a really central part of this work, deliberately, us as organizations doing some of that dismantling work, because as long as we have these systemic racist structures in our agencies, we're not going to be able to produce the policies and the programs that actually meet the needs of communities. So just want to offer that additional reflection on your question. A big one, but an important one, I think. All right, so we have about 10-ish more minutes, and I'm looking at some of the questions. I am going to go ahead, Commissioner Guzman-Aceves, we do have a couple of questions related to net energy metering. So I just wanted to maybe you could go ahead and address some of those. I'm not sure if you're seeing them. I'm happy to read them, but if you see them.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to acknowledge them, and everywhere I go, they're there.
You are the commissioners, though.
Yes, of course, this is the challenge for those of you who may not be aware. We're in the middle of updating our tariff, which is our rate structure, rate compensation structure for rooftop solar. And we are in the midst today as well of having evidentiary hearings on all the different proposals that are before us from across the board. Of course, the utilities have proposals, the solar industry, many of the environmental organizations, and it is a very difficult dialogue to talk about how we can continue to see growth that we need to see in the rooftop solar industry for customers, and really finding and defining what that benefit is to the entirety of the customer base, particularly those customers who are not participating. And maybe just tied into the last conversation of being left behind, the highest number I've seen is 8% or 9% of the participants of rooftop solar of the NEM program are low income. And so we have a program that has primarily benefited non-low income customers in a very good way, and trying to define what the system benefit is for all customers. So we're in the middle of that, and I very much look forward to all the ideas. There's so many creative ideas that have been put forward to find that balance moving forward. And I just wanted to also acknowledge, Monica, the statement you made on, our history in this country, and in particular how that's led to an economic gap when it comes to wealth. And if we continue with the sentiment that that has nothing to do with our work, we're not going to address it. And I can't tell you that in my world, that is a constant refrain, that we need to just incentivize electrification, incentivize buildings, incentivize transportation, incentivize rooftop solar, without taking on the additional component of how we're going to even address the equity issue and the wealth gap, and not leave communities behind as we transition. And that means we have to actually take it on in our programs and our rules to ensure that intentionally, and not just let the market do it. So this is a big issue within our organization, and the feeling that if we put too much direction on who benefits, we slow down the transition. But I think from our collective perspective, it's we have to figure out how to not slow down the transition while keeping the focus on making sure these investments are equitable. So real issue for sure.
Thanks, Commissioner. Just looking, well, here's, we're talking mostly about regulatory policy and enforcement, but there is a question in here that I think is interesting related to investment. Comment plus a question that just came in. So set asides to disadvantaged or low income communities that are anything less than 50% are off over time ineffective. Goes on to say how, if it's 25%, it means 75% is immediately taken up by the wealthy that have the capacity to utilize it. These medical set-asides perpetuate an increase in inequities. Would you, us at the PUC, but going to invite Ashley and Chanel to reflect on it as well, consider allocating bigger chunks of investments and capacity building and technical assistance such that we can move towards more of a 50-50 balance. I think we are starting to see like bigger set-asides in place to kind of get at this, but I don't know if Commissioner or Chanel in particular, if y'all have any thoughts on some of these set-aside questions.
I'm going to defer to the Commissioner first since this.
Okay, well, I support 100%, but I've never gotten the votes for that. And, even within, I'll say just, I know one of your sponsors of the SOMA program, we're having a real live dialogue around that money is only for low income housing. But what we've seen is the investment in those multifamily solar programs have gone to low income. They have to be low income, but they haven't really been in disadvantaged communities. They're still really lagging behind. And even within our low income community there's been some resistance to putting a higher threshold of being in disadvantaged communities. So we're not, to say as an example, we have this elderly community down the street from me, not in a disadvantaged community. Is that where it should be going, or should we be prioritizing the, low income housing in a disadvantaged community? So there's even within the question of equity, there's an even harder question about, we're seeing it at every level. And so at a macro level, I, of course, support, I agree with this statement. We have to do, if we should be using all of it, we have to get away from this dichotomy that it's either market incentive and develop the market versus helping poor people, and of course I want to acknowledge some poor people need more capital to get going, but it's still, from my perspective, more important to really focus on that equitable investment at the outset. And I agree it should be higher, but I think, we're getting to a point where there's a little more consensus, at least at the PUC, that it should be at least 50%, which is a growth from 25. But we're not there all the time.
Yeah, definitely. Chanel or Ashley, this will probably be our last question before I ask y'all for some final thoughts. So anything directly on this investment question?
Yeah, go for it, Ashley. I can go after you.
Okay, I was just gonna kind of add a couple thoughts that are like somewhat relevant but tangential. It's just like, one is, there's also of course we are routinely pushing for higher and greater set-asides. There's also the issue of like a lot of different funding that has no set-asides, like, Prop 1 funding for roads. And so we're, fighting these battles at the local level for equitable distribution. And then obviously, there's a whole question about how local funds are used. And, we have attempted to push for like set-aside type programs at the local level and really, like, I think largely failed. And like another kind of interesting way to think about it too, I think, is also like, how our planning departments work at the local level. Like, we have no set aside there to make sure they're planning for affordable housing. Largely in the regions we work in, there's an army of staff to support above market rate development that's predominantly serving above moderate income households, and one or two staff that are like using federally given CDBG dollars to build out affordable housing. So I think the set aside question, it's like one angle to look at distribution of funds, and there's just so many huge ways that we need to tackle the inequities.
Okay, and I think I'm rounding it out. it was an interesting question, so I wanted to think about it before I made any commitments. I think that I agree with the statement that is being said, and I think for myself personally, yes, I absolutely think it makes sense. I think the question that I'm always asking myself about set-asides is one, I think, how do we frame it in a way and provide the context so that people understand? Because I think I've had this conversation with many people before where it's like, well, that doesn't seem fair. Everyone should get the same fair share. And it's like, no, like, right, like, how do we like just even start with the education that no one has had a fair share, right? And so part of what we're doing right now is like, redistributive justice instead of like calling it a set aside. And so I think I'm trying to have that kind of framing myself to kind of move forward this concept, both I think internally and externally. So I will say that, right, that this is, it's less about like, when we call it set asides, I do it too, we all call it set asides, but it's more about how do we get to a place where we actually like want to see equitable outcomes, and some of that comes from equitable investments. I also think that Ashley's point is extremely clear that we tend to do these like set asides on newer programs and leave our existing programs like very much the same, like formula funding. And so the other question for me should be, I think, how do we as government entities get that pressure to not just say like, it's a new pot of funding, great, we're going to give you guys like 25, 50, 80, but that actually we're looking at our existing programs and we're getting that push of, wait a second, if you're doing it for this new program, why are you not willing to change it for these existing ones? And I'm saying push because I think that internally that is not always easy to do, but that's something that I think is really important when we're having this conversation.
Really, thank you. I think that's a huge, huge point. Great, well, we have 3 minutes, so wanted to offer each of you 30 seconds of your parting thoughts in terms of, for our audience and from your perspective, how do we move forward with some of these questions based on our discussion today and anything that wasn't raised. And then real quick, apologies to folks in the Q&A that we didn't get quite to all your questions. Some of them are pretty specific PUC questions. I'm going to see if I can type some out, but just want to offer our speakers some wrap up time. So maybe we'll go in order. Commissioner, then Ashley, then Chanel.
Thank you. Well, it's a really good reminder what Chanel just said about existing programs. And, one of the best things our previous governor did while he was in office is he redistributed the educational funding program to be weighted on low income and English learner students. And that's the largest funding we distribute in the state of California. So we could use his example and take on and really step back to see, and it's particularly at a local level where the local transportation dollars go, where is the, kind of bread and butter, streets and roads. Some of you operate your water and wastewater. Some of those, all of that basic infrastructure is so important that you all know, to the daily lives of people. And it's where adaptation is going to take place. It's certainly where reductions can take place. And, so I encourage you to take that on. And I would just, of course, always end by saying that we are open to more suggestions here. There's a real openness and opportunity from, I think, all the commissioners to reflect on how we can improve. And just taking the lighting example again of the local governments, it's absolutely a perfect example. Undergrounding, lighting, all of these things are kind of the bread and butter, and having the opportunity to really, there's an open door to really look fresh at those programs. So thank you. And thank you for your work at the local level. At every level I see we have here, not just representatives of government, but CBOs and educational institutions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. A couple of thoughts I had. I think 3 things came to mind. One, I think this kind of conversation we started to have about TA roles in government versus enforcement roles is a really important one that could have a lot more discussion. I think we see a lot of instances where there's kind of a blending of those roles, and it's often unclear which hat the agency's wearing. And from an advocacy perspective, it can lead to a lot of frustration of like, there's instances when on the ground, we know there's enforcement needed. You know, we've come to the end of the road with the dialogue, and like communities are impacted now and need to see that enforcement. So I think really looking closely at that and seeing, you know, maybe where clarity is needed. I think, you know, encouraging agencies to like push the envelope on oversight authority. I think there's a tendency sometimes to take conservative interpretations of language that could be read in different ways under statutes. And, you know, I would advocate for like, you know, taking the most aggressive interpretation that is feasible. People need it, you know, people's lives are at stake. And finally, I think the points that were made about like doing the work to learn is critical. We live in a segregated society. You know, most of us are raised in very segregated conditions, economically, racially. A lot of us don't have lived experiences of what it's like to grow up in a different circumstance. So we have to do the work to know people, to hear from them in order to really understand it and to care about it and incorporate it. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I was going to say a couple of things. One, I was so excited to be on this panel because I was definitely like, oh my gosh, this is great to have the commissioner. So I have learned like so much. I think the things that I do want to end with are things that I had said kind of in my talking points. I think one, I'm realizing that at the end of this and kind of after hearing kind of everything we talked about, one of the most important roles for us as government is, I think, to be in a space and to be, I think, have that humility where we are willing to learn, I think, from, community-based organizations who have been doing a lot of the work that we're now trying to do in terms of like centering communities and engaging with communities. And so the more that we can make those partnerships tangible and real, I think, at least in my opinion, the better we're going to see, I think, our enforcement program be in terms of actually understanding the issues on the ground. And then the other piece of that is creating that, that collaboration with the air districts and being really clear on the roles and how we work together feel really huge to me. So those are, I think, pressing things when we're thinking about enforcement, when we're thinking about the complaints that we hear from communities and how we address that. And then I think someone in the chat I brought up, I think with 617 and just the massive amount of communities that we have, those 400 eligible communities, and I think the 15, maybe 16 communities that we currently have. And so I think there's a role for enforcement in AB 617. I didn't get to talk about it a lot today, but that is something that's very much on our mind, is like, how do we take, you know, this program and what we're doing, and how do we start to, I think, build that out, and what does that look like? And I think we're still very much in the brainstorm phase of that right now too.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much again. We are so lucky to have gotten an hour and 15 minutes of your time to each of you. So just a huge thank you for that. Thank you to the participants for hanging out with us until 3:15, and hope that you all got something out of today's discussion to take back to your organizations and then to turn around and advocate to us. But anyways, with that, that's it for me. I'm going to turn it back to Serena to just close us out.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Monica, and to our panel for that valuable conversation and providing such thoughtful answers to our audience questions. It's so important for us to hear directly from our state partners and as well as our CBOs. So please do answer our post-forum survey, which is in the chat, for a chance to win a $50 gift card. And we will see you at our remaining events tomorrow. Thank you so much. Have a good day.